You probably remember the story of the emperor who had no clothes. This enterprising scoundrel had convinced the emperor that the suit of clothing he had sold him was visible to everybody except the emperor, and of course everybody else was afraid to suggest that perhaps the emperor was off his rocker, except for the little boy in the crowd who hollers out, "Hey, he's got no clothes on!" And the spell was broken. I'm Joe Tye, CEO of Values Coach, and your coach for this course on the 12 Core Action Values. And that's what honesty does. It breaks the spell. That's what Sharon Watkins did at Enron. She broke the spell. Hey, these guys got no clothes on. This is wrong. Honesty is the first cornerstone of integrity. You cannot trust somebody who's not being honest. And one of the real challenges in our life is to be honest. Here's an example of how easy it is not to be. Lori Palatnik and Bob Berg, in their book on gossip, say that the greatest villain, when two people are talking about somebody else and a third person is just listening, the greatest villain is the one just sitting there listening. That is fundamentally an act of dishonesty. That is enabling dishonesty. That's like everybody else in the crowd waiting for the little boy to say, "Hey, this ain't right." Honesty begins with yourself. And you know, we often cheat ourselves by being dishonest about our abilities. If you're not honest with yourself, it's hard for you to be honest with other people. We deny the problems that we're facing. We're not honest about the reality of our situation, and we get ourselves in a lot of trouble. And I'll give you a simple example. Two of the most dishonest words in the English language are "I can't." Anytime you hear yourself uttering those toxic two words, remember, you're probably telling yourself a lie. Every year I go down into the Grand Canyon, spend a week or so down there. It's my way to get away. And you know, it's funny, when you're down there, you'll run into somebody who's hiked all the way down and their knees hurt and they have blisters and they're fatigued, and they look at that incredible wall, the 4,500 foot hike out with no elevator, and they say, "I can't." Well, trust me, there is no refugee camp down there at the bottom of the Grand Canyon for all the people who hiked in and couldn't hike back out. Everybody eventually, somehow, makes it out. And they're usually proud of themselves for doing it. Anytime you hear yourself uttering those toxic two words, "I can't," remind yourself it's probably not true. What you're really saying is, "I don't want to. It would be hard, it would be expensive, it would be inconvenient. I got better things to do." Truth is, you probably can. And if you add the word "yet," "I can't yet," that forces you to ask the question, what do I have to do in order to be able to turn can't into can? In order to turn that lie, "I can't," into an honest statement. I can, but first I need to do something else. Now, here are three ways that our honesty can be jeopardized. And the first is denial. There are a lot of people in serious financial trouble today who were in financial trouble 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, but did not admit to themselves how badly they were managing their finances, how deeply they were in debt. They were denying their problems, and that's a fundamental act of dishonesty. Something that it can be more sinister, and I'll give you an example, is partial honesty leading to a total lie. When I was at the Stanford Business School, I did an independent study project on ethics in the tobacco industry. And that is an oxymoron. There are none. And I spoke with a senior vice president at Philip Morris, and he was going on and on about trying to poke holes in all of the scientific evidence showing that cigarette smoking was harmful. This was some years ago when they were still debating that. Debating, I say. And he cited a case, the Framingham Heart Study, and he said that in Framingham they found that moderate smokers had twice the risk of dying of a heart attack as non-smokers, but that heavy smokers had an even lower risk. He says, what's that tell you? You ought to smoke a lot to protect yourself from heart disease. It tells you that they just don't know. And you know, he had been doing this for decades. James Bowling was his name. He's very good at it. If you saw the movie Death in the West, he was in it. It turns out that every single thing he said to me was factually true. What made it a big lie is what he left out. The people who were heavy smokers had such high lung cancer rates that they tended to die at a young enough age that their hearts couldn't give out on them. He told me a big lie by weaving together a lot of little truths. And the third thing that is probably more prevalent, and if less sinister, is dishonesty that comes from peer pressure, from the pressure of your corporate culture. And I'll give you a personal example. I had LASIK eye surgery a couple years ago. I was told ahead of time that I was, and I quote, a perfect candidate. Now, it turns out that was not an honest diagnosis. I was not a perfect candidate. I had several pre-existing contraindicating conditions. Now, I do not believe that the doctors there were dishonest. Quite to the contrary. I think they're very honest people. I do not believe they're incompetent. Quite to the contrary. What I do believe is that they are under incredible pressure to produce profits to do surgery. And that at the margins, and I was probably at that margin, at the margins they cut corners a little bit. And they end up fudging the truth a little bit. It's something that anybody who works in an organization, meaning more than two people in a room, needs to be careful of. And in healthcare, it is a huge topic today. One of the hottest topics in the field is when the doctor is also an entrepreneur, when the hospital is also a business, how do you make sure that the patient's interests are being looked out ahead of the economic interest of the provider? And it ultimately boils down to honesty. One last thing about honesty. It's been said that the truth is more important than the facts. And that's one of those beautiful paradoxical statements. The truth is more important than the facts. And I'll give you a personal example. When I was in high school, I was a bit of a troublemaker, you might say. And one day I had this teacher who was just at his wit's end. He had tried everything. And so he cleared out the trophy case in the main hallway, put a chair in the trophy case, put me in the chair, and made me sit there. It was the most humiliating experience. Didn't do much for my self-esteem, I'll tell you. Now, looking back over the years, I felt pretty resentful about that. And then it occurred to me, the facts were that he humiliated me, hurt my self-esteem, and probably would have been kicked out of the teaching profession today for doing something like that. But the truth is, he saw in me a kid who was headed for trouble. And he was thinking, if you can't discipline yourself, and nothing I've done up to this point has helped, you're not just going to end up in a glass trophy case. You may end up in a cage for many years. And I think he was trying, as inelegantly as it was, he was trying in a good faith way to help me, to make me grow up. The facts were that he abused me, at least emotionally. He humiliated me. The truth is, he was trying to help me, and in a good faith way. So what every historian knows, the past is what you choose to remember. I can remember the facts, terrible man, or I can remember the truth. He really was trying to help me. What is your truth? That is what honesty is ultimately all about. It's not just not telling lies. It is that search for the ultimate, the underlying truth. Now, the next cornerstone is reliability. We'll cover that in the next module. And I hope that I can expect you to reliably show up. See you then.